Well, I was just telling Charles off stage that one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to have this conversation is that there's arguably no other issue that the case of our competitors, those who want the conservative movement to move away from freedom, what our competitors argue is that the biggest reason above all, the primary reason that we have to move away from individual economic and political freedom is because the communities that are struggling in America today, the reason that they're struggling is because there's been too much freedom. And the book that is most cited to make those arguments is Coming Apart by Charles Murray, who's a signatory of the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. So we're really grateful that you're here, Charles, and we're also grateful to be joined by Carrie Sheffield, whose new book, The Motorhome Prophecies, as I mentioned before, has just come out, and Kevin Korth of AEI and the Center of Opportunity and Social Mobility, if I've got that right. I think they should have called it Cosmo, but you went with COSM for some reason, much harder to pronounce, which is doing a lot of empirical research on this very topic. So this is, I think, a perfect panel to address this very important component of our intellectual project. I'm going to start with you, Charles. What's your reaction to that fact that your book and the problems that you've identified have become such a part of the case for restricting freedom?
I wasn't aware that had happened. I mean, I don't get out much anymore, and that has simply not been brought to my attention. My reaction is, how did they come up with that? As the kinds of problems we have in Fishtown,
Tell people who haven't read your book what Fishtown is.
Fishtown is sort of the shorthand for working class, specifically white working class, because that's what I talked about in Coming Apart. Fishtown is actually a working class suburb not suburb, it's part of the city of Philadelphia. But you can think of it as high school educated, working at blue collar jobs, that population, which is a big population. And I'm saying to myself, the problems that they have boil down to two indicators that also point to the difficulty of the solution. And the two indicators are male labor force participation and marriage rates. So that, I'll just take a few minutes to elaborate on this, because I think those are at the core of the problem we're talking about. You know, if you go back to 1960, which seems like an awful long time ago, but that's when the problem started, we're in the mid-1960s. If you go back to 1960, if you were male and healthy and working aged, you were in the labor force. And statistically, you're talking close to 100%. And by the way, there was no racial break in that. Black men, white men participated in the labor force at just about the same rates, namely just about everybody. And now, you're looking at about 16% of all males of prime working age who are out of the labor force, 16%, up from effectively zero. And that started in the mid-1960s, and if you look at the trend line, it's just been going steadily upward since then. So that's one problem, because if you have a lot of guys out of the labor force, you do not have functioning communities in many respects. You have a real drain on the resources of the community. But that's intertwined with the other problem, which is marriage. So that 1960, about 80-odd% of working class males were married. It was very high. It wasn't quite as high as it was among the college educated, but that's real high. It's now less than half. And the age group I'm talking about here is 25 to 54. So even if you say, oh, people getting married later and so forth, it doesn't change the picture. You have basically a collapse of marriage in the working class. And you combine those two things, and what do you have? You have a whole lot of single-parent households. You have a whole lot of males who are not raising their kids. You have a lot of people dependent on the government. And in addition to that, and this is something we'll talk about more later, you also have drastic demoralization of that population. And so you take those things together and you say, they've had too much freedom. And I'm saying 1960, they did not have anything except freedom. I mean, you had no income supports, you had no social service supports, especially for males. You were basically on your own, and guess what? It was a set of norms and expectations the society had then, which were precisely intimately connected with a very limited government and very wide freedoms, which also demanded the flip side, the other side of the coin of freedom, which is responsibility for the consequences of your actions. And we can go into later as to the ways that's been undercut. I'll stop there.
No, that's a great point. So to summarize, you'd say that the point you're making is that in 1960 we didn't have the Great Society welfare state that we have today. People were more free, at least economically back then. The nationalists might respond, but Reagan signed no fault divorce law into existence in California, and that libertarians were really they were in the 60s people who said, hey, marriage is not that important. Self-actualization is more important. That's why all this broke down.
Yeah, there is an element of saying that there was a lot more libertinism in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. That's not quite the same as liberty. And in particular, it is a severing of actions from consequences that cut across all sorts of things. For example, and this is most obviously true in the case of having babies out of wedlock, an old-fashioned term. Non-marital births is what they're called now. And the reason that was so low, single digits in 1960, as it had been throughout American history, was there were huge consequences, responsibility for the consequences of actions. And among others, it wasn't just the woman who suffered enormous consequences if she got pregnant and was not married, and those were extremely severe, both economically and also in terms of social stigma. The guy did too. So that if you got a girl pregnant in 1960, not only was she saying, you've got to marry me, that's your responsibility, so were the woman's brothers and her father. And there was a reason for that term, shotgun marriage, because sometimes a shotgun literally was involved, but certainly there was enormous pressure to make good on the consequences of your action. In almost every field you want to name, the last 60 years have seen an attempt to buffer people from the consequences of their actions, and that is what has come along with less freedom, not more freedom.
Kevin, how would you add to what Charles has said about the data of Fishtown today?
Sure, and I guess I would echo Charles in that I think there has been a decrease in freedom in many ways, which has driven some of these trends. I mean, it used to be the case that if you had sort of distressed areas and better off areas of the country, and over time they'd kind of converge because the lower income areas would become better off and get better jobs and higher wages. That kind of convergence has stopped over the past several decades. And so people can no longer really move to opportunity where those from Fishtown can get higher wages, get better opportunities for their kids. And I think one major reason for that is an increase in regulation of our housing market, whether it's minimum lot sizes, overly burdensome environmental restrictions, parking spot requirements. All these things make it much more expensive to live in these higher opportunity areas and make it easier to sustain a Belmont, which is the rich suburb of Boston, where you have these people who are sort of hoarding opportunity for themselves and not being surrounded by the working class folks of Fishtown and not affording them the opportunity to be a part of that. So I think that's a big part of this story of what we're seeing. It's not just at the individual level, but these wholesale communities that are being left behind because you don't have, you're getting in the way of this economic process where lower income areas become better off, people can move to opportunity. If that becomes too expensive, then you're sort of keeping Fishtown, you're keeping it poor and not allowing that, that integration and improvement of the welfare of the bottom, the distribution to actually happen.
So what would you say are the, what are the sorts, not so much specific policies, it could be specific policies, but what are the policy outcomes that you think would have the most effect on the fortunes of people who live in Fishtown? What do we need to do? What do we need to achieve for them to be better off?
Yeah, I think it's, I think one would be, relaxing restrictions on housing. Another one would be more school choice. So even if you can't afford to live in these higher income areas, and maybe you can go to a school that has some of those better opportunities. But I guess so those are really local policies. And so from a federal level, I don't have a lot. I would say that we do have a safety net in the country that has expanded greatly over time, from especially since the early 60s with the war on poverty. And that includes programs like the supplemental security, like disability insurance for low income and working class people. That includes a ever expanding Medicaid and food stamp or SNAP program and housing assistance. So we do have a growing safety net that does touch the lives of essentially all low-income families and many of these lower-income detached males through the disability programs. And so if we want to do something from federal policy, I think it's important to make sure, I think we do want a safety net, given our how prosperous we are as a nation, but making sure that it always rewards those things that Charles is talking about, especially work and marriage. We've done a lot in terms of rewarding work, especially in the 1990s. We had a lot of single moms who were not working, who then went to working once we started to require work and to reward it. But we focused a lot less on the marriage component, which is probably a mistake. There's actually a lot of proposals today that would substantially increase benefits really for single moms with kids. I think out of this notion of we got to increase fertility, have more kids, which I love fertility, I love kids, but at some point that starts to discourage marriage. If you have these single moms who can get a lot of benefits from working part-time, but then if they get a spouse, that means that they're actually going to be worse off as a result. And so I think we need to be very careful about maintaining the safety net that we have, but kind of pushing in the direction of not only work, but also not inadvertently discouraging marriage, which are the two central ingredients for a prosperous life.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're bringing up, because the expansion of the child tax credit is something that a lot of nationalists or new rightists, quote unquote new rightists, have been really campaigning on, saying we've got to do this because that's pro-family. But the child tax credit is not tied to actually being in a family. It's just if you have a kid, which may have the effect of subsidizing births out of wedlock. At least there's good reason to believe that that would be the case, and that seems to have not been part of the debate.
Yeah, unfortunately so. I think Vice President J.D. Vance on the campaign trail advocated for a $5,000 per kid child tax credit, not tied to work or tax liability. The current maximum is $2,000 per kid. So this is not only a huge fiscal liability for the country, but it does have some of these same problems where when you stack that on top of the existing safety net from Medicaid and food stamps and housing assistance and other nutrition programs, and on the top of that another $5,000, it really cuts can cut the other spouse out of the picture if now you can raise a family on all these things, which we really want to support low-income families. We don't want kids to be in poverty, but if you keep on layering on top of these programs, you do create this dynamic where it's like now the government can provide this subsistence, and you don't need to look towards fuller time work or marriage.
Carrie, you grew up poor, but the point of your new autobiography, Motorhome Prophecies, is not so much the economic conditions, it's more everything else that went along with your life experience. So talk to us about that, about if you want to talk about the economics, go ahead, but I know for you a lot of it was non-economic in nature, and what were some of the challenges that you faced of a non-economic dimension?
Yeah, so if you guys are interested, you want the full 90,000 word download, it's available. I had some generous donors give some complimentary copies, so they're going fast. The book's called Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. My publisher calls it a cross between Hillbilly Elegy and Educated by Tara Westover. When I give remarks, I'm careful to distinguish what my father did from the official Mormon church, the LDS church, as they prefer to be called now. My father claimed to be a Mormon prophet, so he made my 7 biological siblings and I live in a motorhome. We also lived in sheds and tents. When I took my ACT exam, we were living in a shed in the Ozarks of Missouri with no running water and no heat. So I know how to talk like this. If anyone also knows how to talk like this, I know this is, thank you. The one slur that Charles Murray talks about, you can still say redneck. That's the one ethnic slur that's allowed. But in any case, I took my ACT exam in those conditions, while living in those conditions. Eventually, 4 of my siblings attempted suicide. I was suicidal. I had PTSD. Severe anxiety, fibromyalgia, was hospitalized multiple times for anxiety, depression. And from that, eventually, after many bumps and bruises, got a full scholarship to Harvard for a master's degree in public policy, worked on Wall Street, was able to work. I feel like I'm in an AEI sandwich here because we've got AEI folks here. I used to work for Edward Conard, who is an AEI scholar, and have in many respects been able to live the American dream. And my observations, I loved reading Coming Apart. I thought its observations were so astute, and I think what's been missing from anyone who says it's the big government on the left or big government on the right is missing the point of the book, which is it's a collapse in morality and culture. That's really the problem here, and you're not going to regulate that unless you want to turn into the Taliban. And so it's really the cultural mores that have collapsed. And if I may, I brought notes. I know you're sometimes okay with notes. Just to read from the architect of our country, George Washington, in his farewell address, he said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." So I don't care how many income supports you create. I don't care about your housing policy. These are all important, yes, but to me, they're all secondary to the fundamental collapse of morality in our country. And Kay, I don't know if Kay's still here, but what she said about white liberals being the cause of problems, I agree with that. The 60s, they brought drugs, sex, and rock and roll. They normalized that. Hollywood basically normalized the cultural acceptance of unmarried births. They brought, the demand for drugs was caused by this cultural collapse, this calamity, where it normalized this behavior in Fishtown, which is it's not normalized in Belmont, as Charles so wonderfully says. And so I think our problem is, as Charles also diagnoses, is that the people who live in Belmont don't actually preach what they practice. There are some exemptions to that. Like I like Brad Wilcox's book that he recently wrote called Just Get Married, encouraging marriage. But the problem with that book, as much as I love it, is that the other problem conservatives have is that we don't understand how to talk about mental health. We don't understand intergenerational trauma, because you can tell a woman who's come from a broken home, you can tell her to just get married, but who are the men in her life that she might marry? Well, it's a convict who's also violent. Maybe he's a drug addict himself. So you don't want that man in the home, actually. You actually don't. And he's got to go through major rehab. He's got to go through a major heart transformation, which is what I had to do in order for me to come from wanting to kill myself multiple times to where I am today. It was not programs, it was God. The solution to all of this is returning to God, and that's what made America different. That's what made America exceptional, is that we were a country founded in God we trust, not in the earned income tax credit we trust, any of that. Anyway, I could keep going.
I'd like
Please,
to,
Charles.
I'd like to not only assent to that, I want to say Carrie has even underestimated the degree of the problem we have. I'm much better at talking about
I
problems
can
than I
talk
am
more.
solutions.
Don't
So just let me sketch for you how difficult this situation is, largely because, as Carrie just said, there has been a collapse of norms and expectations. The question is this: why is it that historically men who are in their early to mid-20s, in the prime of their wanting to sow wild oats, in sort of the nadir of male judgment, which occurs, some would say, well into the middle 30s, but it's certainly very bad in the early 20s. Why is it that historically, in lots of different kinds of societies, men were eager to get married at that time of their life, including in the United States? Well, there were some very basic reasons that no longer apply. One was that's the only way you became a full-fledged member in good standing of that community. If you were in your late 20s, early 30s, and you still weren't married and still didn't have a wife and children, you were already a little odd. And as time went on, even if you were working and supporting yourself, you were not really a full-fledged member of that community, and you did not partake of a whole variety of status rewards. So that, and this was true in black communities and white communities alike, so that if you were a working class guy, again, I'll go back to 1960, not because it was heaven, but it was way different than it is today. In 1960, if you were a working class guy, but you were putting food on the table and a roof over the head of a wife and children, you were a man, and you were a member in not only in good standing, but with the respect of the people in your community. That went away, all right? Why is it that you got married not just for abstract status rewards? There was something else. They wanted regular access to sex with a woman. And it's going to be very hard for the younger members of this audience to believe this, but as someone who was a teenager in 1960, I guarantee you it was true. It was really hard to get laid in those days if you weren't married, because first place, the girls just wouldn't agree to it. And the second thing is that you knew if you got your girlfriend pregnant, you were going to have to marry her. So that served as a deterrent to behave. When people say, you can't expect me to believe that teenage boys change their behavior because of fear of that, and I say, yeah, I know from personal experience it changes their behavior because of worrying about things like that. Well, by the mid-1960s, all that had changed.
So is it the birth control pill that changed society?
Oh, that
not the
was
libertarians?
that had a huge effect on females because it gave them a safe way to engage in sexual activity without having to rely on the male's cooperation. So that had a huge effect. This is an overdetermined problem, Avik, meaning that we have more causes than we need for you had kind of a perfect storm. But very central to all of this, too, was a very hard economic reality. And I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which the social stigma and the rest of it derived from that hard economic reality. And this, what I'm going to say, is very unfair to women in one sense, but it's also completely accurate in another. That if you got pregnant, it was the woman who paid the price. She was left holding the baby in a situation where she not only faced social stigma, but it was really hard to support that child, because even though AFDC existed at that time, it was very, very small payment. A woman with a child and no husband was not an economically viable unit. And so there were severe hardships that were faced. And again, during the 1960s, we saw the steady incremental relaxation of all that. Now, this is where I guess I'll disagree with Kevin. I don't think that changing the economics of having a baby is going to make much difference. You have countries all over Europe and, for that matter, in Asia, especially South Korea, that are trying very hard to improve the birth rates, increase the birth rates, because they're way below replacement. I do not know of a single solitary program which has produced an important increase in fertility. And you've had some pretty radical attempts to have pro-natality programs. So we have no evidence that we know how to get people, incentivize people to have more babies through government assistance. And
birth rates are falling all over the world, not just in the
all
West.
over the world, everywhere. So some point during this conversation, I want us to think in terms of a unhappy possibility. And that unhappy possibility is there is no way out for the communities that are being left behind that we're talking about. That we are not going to go back to the old social norms because it's not in the cards both economically and culturally as far as I can tell. We aren't going to buy our way out of it with pro-natality policies. And we have a couple of other things going on that are very disheartening. And one is, what are the incentives at this point for not 16% of males out of the labor force in the working class? What are the incentives for that to get much larger? And those incentives are very powerful. As it stands, we know how these guys who are out of the labor force in the working class are spending their time. They're spending it mostly playing video games and watching television, and with some time taken off for doing drugs. And that's about it. What's going on with regard to, for example, being able to distract yourself, entertain yourself 24/7? You thought about what's happening to video games, which have gone from Donkey Kong at the turn of the century to the kinds of extremely elaborate virtual reality games we have now, and we're going to soon be in a 3D world of wraparound goggles and so forth, where essentially you can escape into whatever world you want to escape into, and that looks like a lot more fun than holding down a low-paying working-class job. As you look ahead to what changing technology is going to do, it's very hard to see any scenario in which the incentives to drop out of the labor force do not get stronger rather than weaker for men. And just so I leave no pessimistic stone unturned, let me add that don't say if the economy provides better paying jobs, that's going to change anything. Do you know what the average UPS driver makes per year? $145,000. A master plumber makes six figures easily. You have craftspeople and skilled tradespeople all over the country and contractors all over the country who are desperate to get apprentices for very high-paying, skilled blue-collar jobs, and they can't get people to take those apprenticeships. They're offering good salaries, the prospect of much better salaries, and that's not helping at all. So
why is it? Why is it that people aren't willing to take those $145,000 a couple? They'd rather be on disability making much less than playing video games? Or what's the reason?
You had a person described it to me this way. He says, you've got a guy whose wife is a school teacher, and so she's bringing home $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. He has put together a package of benefits that is far more valuable than I realized, and I wouldn't be surprised, far more valuable than any of us do. The debate in which I got completely creamed, I lost hugely, was when I was arguing in favor of a universal basic income that would replace all the welfare programs. And I'm still happy to make the theoretical case for that. But my opponent, Jared Bernstein, who was in the Biden administration, destroyed me because he documented chapter and verse that people could already put together a package that was worth more than the $12,000 per person that I had as a universal basic income. So you've got this guy whose wife is pulling down the salary as a teacher, and he can put together a pretty hefty package. Put together, they're approaching, and if he does a little off-the-books work, he can spend a lot of time going fishing and doesn't feel like he's demeaning himself by taking a low-paying manual job.
So is the solution then to actually have a less free economy? Should we ban video games and ban the goggles?
This is the problem, Avik. So many of the forces that are going to keep this problem going are things that there are no cures for. It's not that there are no cures that are ideologically acceptable to people in this room. It's that we don't know how to do it, period. And that's why, as I'm looking ahead, I think of all the dystopian visions, the one that was the most accurate was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where you have an elite and then you have this large class that is just drugged up on soma all the time. And as I look ahead, and also we're going to have increasingly wealthy world. So, it's going to be easier and easier to have free riders. I think the prospect of a permanent dropout lower class that we try to work around is the most plausible future.
Carrie, bring us out of that dystopia.
Well, no, it's interesting because I actually quote extensively from Brave New World in my book because I actually felt like the protagonist when I first left my family cult. If you recall, I don't want to spoil it for you in that book, but the protagonist hangs himself because he hates this world that he grows up in a wild world where there's love and Shakespeare and normal behavior, and he goes into the Soma Society and he can't handle it, so he kills himself. And that's how I felt when I left my family's cult and I went to a state college in Missouri, and I was like, all these people do is, like, my roommate's boyfriend dropped out. He was in a fraternity and he got high and played video games all day and dropped out of college. And I'm like, all they're doing is partying and getting drunk all day. Like, why go to college if this is all that? And even these are the kids from Belmont that are doing this. And so Fishtown has no chance if this is the Belmont behavior that our college system. If you've read the book I Am Charlotte Simmons by Tom Wolfe, that was a lot of my experience coming out of my childhood and going into college, the shock, because I was raised on the fringe of American society, and then I went into the mainstream society, and I was like, what happened to America? They're just binge drinking and doing drugs, and we're here to learn, we're supposed to be. But what got me out of it, again, I think one thing, I don't know, Charles, if you've looked at data about Gen Z, which gives me hope to pull me out of the dystopia, is that Gen Z is actually, the men in particular, and I'm like, man, I'm a grandma millennial, I'm like, I should have been a Gen Zer. Like, the Gen Z men are becoming more religious than millennial women. In fact, Gen Z men are becoming more conservative than women. And I actually think that's very interesting as a woman, because historically it was actually women who were the more conservative ones. Women were the ones who were leading prohibition, for example. And then that flipped, I think, with the 60s. And heck, I'm glad I can access the workforce and certain jobs that I couldn't as a woman before that. But I do feel that the pendulum has swung way too far. The breakdown of the family and the normalization of that, the feminization of poverty, that I detest the phrase that feminists say, which is, look, it's my job to dismantle the patriarchy, and it's like, well, this is what we've done. This is what we've done in Fishtown. We've dismantled the patriarchy, and what are the results? It's utter chaos. Again, what Kay was saying about white liberals, LBJ, who Charles talks in his book, starting the Great Society programs, if one were a white supremacist, which LBJ was a notorious racist, they would do exactly what he did, which is to take, before welfare, 75% of black babies born to two-parent homes with lower crime and a declining poverty rate, improving in educational attainment rate, and then put these programs that ruin their lives such that now only 25% are. I mean, that would be the results if one were a white supremacist, which LBJ arguably was. He got what he wanted, while also convincing them that's what they needed. And so I think again, from my personal experience, and I see John Hart here. John and I used to work together with Paul Ryan, who I know that's a blast from the past. And we toured around with Bob Woodson. If folks know Bob Woodson in this room. Bob, we call him a 4-star general in the war on poverty. And one of the things he would say over and over was, because Bob Woodson was a master, he fought to get the initial civil rights package of bills moved, and then he saw, when you're talking about we don't want discrimination, but then he saw the NAACP was like then wanting welfare, and he's like, no, we want civil rights, but we don't need welfare. And so he dropped out of working for the NAACP because he said this isn't what we need. And so instead he spent his career touring the country, seeing what works. It's the laboratories in fighting poverty, homelessness, gangs, drugs. And he said that the top solution was God. And again, I'm coming back to that over and over.
How can public policy bring that solution to bear, or can it not?
Well, it's interesting because Congress will make no law creating a religion. So I'm not advocating for a state religion at all. But I'm arguing for a cultural renewal, and I think there are things that government can certainly make sure that it's not persecuting or going after religious people. Government can do things that encourage pro-social behavior or encourage collaboration. On the issue of mental illness, for example, mental illness is a significant problem across income gaps, but in particular working class. You're talking about basically having a better faith-based apparatus for mental health care delivery. And that's something that I actually have hope with RFK, if he's able to carve that out, because RFK is a heroin addict recovery, or he recovered from heroin addiction, and he credits God for that. He actually said that he got his hands on a book by Carl Jung. Jung was one of the most famous psychologists who promoted integrating faith into therapy. And I've seen this in my life. The best delivery of mental health care is through faith-based practitioners. And yet, 2/3 of our therapists self-identify as atheist or agnostic, which is shocking considering that, according to Gallup, 81% of people say they believe in God. And so there's a great researcher at Harvard Medical School who is devout Jewish. He's done a lot of research on this, and he found that 73% of mental health care patients say, I want faith integrated into my mental health care, and yet 71% of therapists say, I have little to no training on how to do that. And so it's become this, and Abigail Schreier's excellent book that came out last year called Bad Therapy diagnoses a lot of the problems with our mental health care delivery system. And just so you know the scope of mental illness in our country, we have the highest depression rate ever recorded. We have the highest suicide ever recorded. In 2023, the most recent data we have, it was more than 50,000 people who committed suicide, which is 17 times the number of people killed in 9/11. And we have not seen the runner-up to the highest level of depression that we have now was just coming out of the Great Depression in 1941. And I went back and I looked at the GDP per capita. What was the GDP per capita in 1941? Again, to Charles' point on, it's not going to be just economics to get you out of it. We were basically a third world country on a GDP per capita basis in 1941. And so we have people today who are far wealthier. They can cobble together this package of benefits that is like a king or queen compared to back then. So something's different. And I do believe, as again, Coming Apart shows, the strongest variable of what happened with the collapse of Fishtown was the collapse of the church, the collapse of the centering of the church as the centerpiece of what works. And so I am hopeful because I am seeing a renewal of faith. I am seeing a renewal of, again, men stepping up and taking faith in God as taking that step. You're seeing a renewal of men going to Orthodox church and Catholic. I'm Protestant, so I'm like, when are the Protestant men going to show up? But there's a 12% gender gap with Protestants, unfortunately. against me. But for Orthodox, it's about 50-50 gender, which is interesting. And so, and it was interesting because when I was working with Bob Woodson as he was touring the country, seeing what works, at the time I was not a believer. I was agnostic. I spent 12 years as an agnostic because I was coming out of severe religious abuse and trauma because my father put a curse on me in the name of Jesus. He actually, when I said one of my 2 schizophrenic brothers groped me and tried to rape me when I was 17. And by the time I turned 18, I said, I'm living in a motorhome with 10 people, including a 200-pound man who wants to rape me. Like, I can't do this anymore. So I told my dad, I want to go to college. He raised his hand and he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave. And so I did not like Jesus for a long time. I spent about 12 years agnostic, and that was when I met Bob Woodson. And so when I would go with Bob and he would say, God this, God that, I'm just like, whatever, Bob. But in my head, I'm just like, pro-family, pro-small government, those are all good things. But I didn't actually believe it. I didn't actually believe that was the solution. And then I just fell into, it wasn't, and the book gets into the details. Anyway, coming out of the thing that was most durable for my mental health and my recovery was eventually when I came out of what I call my crisis of meaning. It was God. And so eventually I said to Bob, I was like, now I get it after I became Christian. I'm like, this is actually what does work. And what's interesting is that when you're talking about, like I mentioned, all the data showing, study after study, Psychiatric Times did a literature review of more than 130 studies, strong relationship between God and low suicide, low depression, strong family formation. And so as someone who was in religious trauma, spent 12 years agnostic, and then I founded a nonprofit called Healthy Faith, which is finding that healthy balance. And I think that's really how our society will recover. And because the data is there, the data shows that faith is strongly correlated. It's interesting, as I was hearing Charles also talk about the dystopia, I'm from Utah, and even though I'm not LDS anymore, Utah is in many ways, do we have anybody from Utah in this room? Any Utahns? Great. Utah has the highest social mobility in the entire country, which means a child born to the bottom quintile is most likely to end up in the top. And so I say in the book, for me, even though I'm not LDS, I say I'm happy to talk theology, theologically wrong, culturally strong for me. And I am so impressed with the culture of Utah. And in many respects, Utah is like a generation behind the rest of the country. And so when I spent portions of my childhood in Utah, it was like the 60s hadn't happened yet. Yeah. And the family formation is strong because faith is so strong.
And let me use that as a perfect segue for Kevin, because Kevin Center and Scott Winship, who's an old friend of mine, and you have done a lot of work on exactly this topic. You call it social capital, and you've tried to measure social capital around the country and where are the bright spots. What can we learn from your work on social capital, and what kind of social capital is the biggest driver of social mobility and economic success and prosperity?
Sure, yeah. So social capital is sort of like referring to the wealth of relationships. So family, friends, community, religious communities, things that provide values that you can help you out when you have a tough economic time, or to provide like someone who tells you what you need to do because you're not getting your stuff together. So we've done work that looks at building this individual level measure of social capital. Unfortunately, we find, I think unsurprisingly so, that those with the lowest levels of social capital are also those with the lowest levels of economic well-being. So there's sort of a double-edged sword of not only have low economic means, but also you don't have those relationships that can help you escape from that, which I suspect is why you see Utah being the #1 state actually in social capital, in addition to economic mobility, because those two things go together. So I think for policy implications, we can't only focus on economic well-being, even if that's all we care about. We have to focus on family and community and churches and religious communities, because those are just as important for helping to lift people out. I think the biggest detriment to all this is that we have this separation of the Belmont and the fish towns. And I have some optimism on this because I don't think people are going to, I think a lot of people won't accept that there's going to be this sort of elite class who lives on its own and then everybody else. I mean, you already see this in the so-called YIMBY movement, the yes in my backyard, where people want more housing to be built in higher income areas so that more people have access to that. I think the language of even diversity and inclusion, which I like diversity and inclusion. I don't want the government to force it on me, but I think there's an implicit demand for that. And I think there's some thought in Silicon Valley that, oh, we can just have a universal basic income and then leave them to it. But there's actually studies now showing that that doesn't work, that the universal basic income is discouraging work. It doesn't lead people to be more creative. It just separates them out. So I have some hope that there's this sort of implicit demand that when people see us become more and more bifurcated, there's more and more an elite class, that some of those elites are going to say, no, we want more housing, and we've been seeing more push towards school choice and vouchers and charter schools. Even in DC where I live, people like charter schools because there is more integration. So I have some hope that there's enough demand to do away from that dystopian vision and get to something that's more holistic, where we can live together in a free society.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but this is a conversation that's going to continue for a long time, and I hope all of you in this room put some thought into it. Thank you so much for joining us, Charles, and Carrie, and Kevin. Thank you.